Thank you for watching my YouTube video lesson on the consequences of the French and Indian War. I'd like to begin by asking you an important question. Which topic do you think has generated the most APUSH questions? The battles fought during the French and Indian War? Or the consequences of the war? Well, if you said the battles, I'm afraid you're wrong. Thus far, the battles, and there were some epic battles, have generated exactly 0 questions. In contrast, the consequences of the war have generated 1 DBQ, 1 long essay, and 2 short answer questions. So clearly, the consequences of the French and Indian War are important, and if you're interested in learning about these consequences, you've come to the right place. My mission is simple. I'm not here to sell t-shirts or coffee mugs. My goal is to help you enjoy American history and earn 4s and 5s on your APUSH exam. So let's turn back the clock and take a look at North America in 1754. Now, as you can see, the French Empire, shown in green, dominated the North American continent. In contrast, Great Britain's 13 colonies were stretched along the Atlantic coast in a very long and narrow line. But the French and Indian War changed everything. It was a long and a costly war. It began in 1754 and ended in 1763. The British and the colonies contributed a combined total of 42,000 soldiers. About half of these soldiers were British regulars, like the young man in this picture, and the other half were colonial militia. Now, the young man in this picture looks a lot like a high school student. He doesn't know it, but he has a very grim and dangerous future ahead of him. The war claimed the lives of 3,012 British soldiers in battle and another 10,400 from disease. So he actually has a 1 in 3 chance of dying in the French and Indian War. Now, the costs of this conflict were apparent, and both France and Great Britain were exhausted from the long struggle. The French king, Louis XV, and the British king, George III, sent negotiators to Paris to try and hammer out an agreement ending the war. Now, the answer to my first question, well, it's obvious. Which powers were present in Paris? The British and the French. But which powers were not present? There were no negotiators or representatives from the colonies, even though, in fact, the colonies contributed half of the manpower in the war. And there were no representatives from the Native American tribes. For example, where were the Iroquois, whose support was instrumental in the British victory? They weren't there. Well, after negotiations, the representatives of the French and British monarchs reached an agreement known as the Peace of Paris. The great 19th century American historian Francis Parkman wrote, "Half a continent changed hands at the scratch of a pen." And you know what? Parkman was right. Look for yourselves. The big green French Empire, it's gone, replaced by the bright red territory of Great Britain, which stretched from the Hudson Bay in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, and from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west. It was truly a vast empire. Now, while the British may have been happy with their victory, That was not the case for the French. Take a look at Louis XV. He seems grim, and he has reason to be grim and upset. France suffered an overwhelming military disaster, a complete national humiliation. Louis XV and his grandson, who would become Louis XVI, thirsted for revenge. They wanted to get back at Great Britain. And of course, they will get their opportunity later on. Well, while the French were bitter, it was a glorious victory for Great Britain. The British won a vast empire with unlimited potential. How big was the empire? Well, it was as big as the Roman Empire at its peak. Put another way, Great Britain won about 500 million acres of new land with unlimited potential. For example, they inherited the lucrative fur trade from the French, and the forests were filled with trees which would make masts for the Royal Navy. Great Britain had reason to feel confident and optimistic. But there were two formidable problems. The war was very costly, and Great Britain's national debt doubled from 72 million pounds to 142 million pounds. Now, I realize that for modern students, this doesn't sound like much. After all, the United States currently has a national debt in excess of $28 trillion. But 142 million was actually a great deal at that time. To help you understand that, keep in mind that the interest on this debt required Great Britain to devote 60% of the budget to paying this interest. This was unsustainable. And the British had another problem. Remember, Great Britain is an island. How can an island govern this vast continent, now over 3,000 miles away? Now, these problems would have challenged any leader, and they certainly required great skill on the part of Great Britain's new king, George III. Take a look at his painting. He looks very young because he is. George III was just 25 years old in 1763 at the time of the Peace of Paris. You know, when you think about it, he was younger than most of your teachers. Now, he was untested and inexperienced. Had he had first-rate advisors, they could have compensated for his weakness. But we now know that he didn't. But of course, that would be in the future. For the colonists, the war's victorious conclusion triggered a surge of pride in the British Empire. It was said that the colonists were never more British than in 1763. Ministers delivered sermons praising Great Britain. For example, listen to what the Reverend Thomas Barnard had to say to his congregation in Massachusetts. Auspicious day, when Britain, blessed with a patriot sovereign, served by wise and faithful counselors. Citizens in New York City agreed, and they raised money to raise a statue, which you can see right here in New York City. The statue placed George III on a horse. In art history, this is called an equestrian statue, and it was actually modeled after the famous equestrian statue of the great Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius. Meantime, most colonists were not raising statues. A lot of them had their eyes on the new frontier west of the Appalachian Mountains. After all, the French threat was now removed, and the new lands created new opportunities for settlers. Trails west, such as the Cumberland Gap, were lined with settlers. This famous painting by George Caleb Bingham captures the spirit of the time. You can see Daniel Boone in the forefront. He's leading pioneers through the Cumberland Gap on their way to settle in Kentucky. The woman on the horse is actually his wife, Rebecca. Boone had once said that all a man needs is a good gun, a good horse, and a good wife. Well, the artist made sure he included all three of these elements in this famous painting. Okay, while the settlers were heading west, there was one group for whom the French and Indian War was an unmitigated disaster. Warriors like the Iroquois warrior shown in this picture were stunned by the French defeat. How could this have happened? And how could the French have negotiated a peace treaty and given away Indian lands? Even worse, the Native Americans lost a key diplomatic tool. Historically, they had successfully manipulated France and Britain by playing balance of power politics. That is to say, they side with one power and then the other. Despite these setbacks, the Iroquois and other Native Americans were still defiant. Although you have conquered the French, you have not conquered us. Now, let's turn our attention to a Delaware prophet named Nowlin. Nowlin claimed to have had revelations from the Master of Life, a spiritual example. And according to Nowlin, the Master of Life implored Nowlin and the Native Americans to reject English culture and return to their traditional lifestyles. Nowlin told the people, if you suffer the English among you, you are dead men. Sickness, smallpox, and their poison, meaning rum, will destroy you entirely. Nowlin's words did not fall on deaf ears. Chief Pontiac, whose picture you can see right here, who looks very resolute and determined, agreed with Nowlin. From his point of view, the British forts symbolized an alien presence that threatened Indian freedom. And he told warriors from other tribes, we must unify. We've got to work together. It's important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from our land this nation which seeks only to destroy us. Drive them out. And they tried to do just that. Pontiac successfully forged an alliance of over 20 tribes. The Indians simultaneously attacked British forts across a vast area, which you can see in this map. Now, modern textbooks only devote a paragraph or two to what they call Pontiac's War. But this map gives you an idea of just how extensive the war actually was. And this chart shows you just how costly the war was. Pontiac's warriors destroyed or captured 8 of 11 British forts. The uprising actually claimed the lives of 500 British soldiers and hundreds of settlers. Some sources say up to 1,500 settlers. Now keep in mind what we learned earlier. The British lost 3,012 soldiers in the whole French and Indian War. And now in the space of a few months, they've lost another 500 soldiers. Well, back in London, King George and his advisors decide we've got to do something about this. This is way too costly. And so they looked at maps and decided the best strategy was to draw an arbitrary line across the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. They would call this line the Proclamation Line of 1763. It prohibited settlement in the area beyond the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. George III thought this was very reasonable. It would keep the two sides apart and stop the conflict. But not everybody was happy. The proclamation infuriated settlers, like the ones you saw in the painting of Daniel Boone, and it also infuriated land speculators who were bent on buying territory in Kentucky and elsewhere and then reselling it at a great profit. Well, as you've seen, the French and Indian War did have momentous consequences. As students of American history, it's important to remember that the fruits of any victory can also sometimes include the seeds of future troubles. Let's take a look at how the French and Indian War affected France, Great Britain, and the colonists. As we learned, the French thirsted for revenge. This would lead France to support the American Revolutionary cause. Their support proved to be instrumental in enabling the colonists to defeat Great Britain. Meanwhile, the British were obsessed with their need to raise revenue, and we've seen why. Their national debt doubled. And so King George III decided, with the advice of his advisors, that the best strategy would be to end the policy of salutary neglect and begin taxing the colonists. Of course, we know that this decision to tax the colonists proved to be a fateful decision. Within a short time, the colonists would be saying, no taxation without representation. Now, what about the colonists? Well, the once fiercely independent colonies suddenly had a new sense of unity derived from fighting together in the French and Indian War. And this unity led to a new sense of an American identity. The colonists no longer saw themselves as submissive subjects of a distant king. They believed that they were equal partners in the British Empire. Now, in future videos, we'll take a look at the steps, fateful steps, which led to the American Revolution. For now, let me say what I said in the beginning. As you see, I'm not here to sell t-shirts or coffee mugs. My goal is to help you enjoy AP American History and earn 4s or 5s on your AP US History exam. Check out my website, insidertestprep.com. You'll find additional resources that include books, multiple choice questions, and short answer questions. Plus, I'm always adding new material to the website. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed today's video lesson.